New approaches to America's housing crisis. I am so excited to welcome our esteemed panelists this morning, and by way of introduction, I will give each of them 90 seconds to share their perspective expertise area, and then we will take a deeper dive. As a reminder, you can leave your questions in the chat feature. We will have questions both throughout our conversation this morning and at the end of our allotted time for about 10 minutes. I'm Catherine Aiyer, the Director of Communications, Outreach, and Marketing for the City of Dallas, and I will start by introducing my colleague, Dr. Eric Anthony Johnson. Good morning, Dr. J.
Good morning. Thank you. First of all, appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion today. Just by way of background, my career has been focused more on what I call city regeneration strategies, which is a combination of economic development, housing, sort of the combination, creating inclusive communities, underserved communities, but with more of a flair towards disruptive type strategies. I just have a philosophy. We've been doing the same things the same way for so long. It's time to really start to look at some different strategies. And I really like to bring that type of creativity to the work of regenerating cities.
Catherine, you're muted.
Thank you. And
I will not be coming to me though, because I'm not.
That's right. Downtown Dallas Inc. CEO Kourtney Garrett.
Thanks, Catherine. I've had the pleasure of working with Catherine for many years, so it's a great honor to be here this morning. Downtown Dallas Inc., just by way of a little bit of a thumbnail, we are a private nonprofit organization working here in the Dallas area. We are both a membership organization and we manage the business improvement district that's geography covers downtown. Many of you in your cities have these business improvement districts, business improvement associations. So we serve both on a very on the ground basis. I have 50 safety patrol officers who are downtown 7 days a week. We have a complimentary clean team who does what it sounds like they do. They pick up trash and remove graffiti and help maintain our environment. And at the same time, we layer onto that with our membership activities, a lot of public policy work, a lot of economic development work. We're thrilled to have Dr. Johnson here in Dallas now, and I love hearing the words disruption. I think it's news to a lot of my stakeholders' ears. And we work a lot in the public policy arena as well. So we're really working on behalf of the private sector, with the public sector to move forward urban revitalization here in Dallas.
Thank you, Kourtney. And next, Steffen from McKinsey.
Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everybody. Steffen Fuchs, I'm a senior partner with McKinsey & Company here in our Dallas office. So very excited to have this conversation today, and thank you for including us. Within McKinsey, I run our global construction and infrastructure practice. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of cities around the world are faced with similar challenges. So a lot of questions we're getting around affordability, affordable housing, how to tie it in, how to make it more than just the affordable housing unit, but how to think about transit and infrastructure as a whole in order to tie those concepts together. And so together with our think tank, the McKinsey Global Institute, we actually have published quite a few perspectives on the housing crisis and the challenge in the US in particular. Some interesting ideas I hope that we can offer today around what are the big unlocks, how to think about reducing the cost of housing and how to make the money available in order to pay for it. And so very excited to be here, looking forward to the conversation, and thank you again for having us.
Thank you, and it's always great when people have ideas on and the ability to pay for them. And finally, Mahesh Aiyer with Citi.
Thanks, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mahesh Aiyer, and I'm with Citi Community Capital, part of Citigroup. And Citi is the largest affordable housing lender in the United States. We finance construction and permanent financing and also equity for affordable housing throughout the United States and territories. And we've been active for several decades in that space. I'm based in Houston and cover the Southern United States for Citi Community Capital. So I've been very active in Texas for some time in all of the various markets, and then very excited to be here today to talk about the impact of affordable housing in Texas.
Thank you so much, Mahesh, and to all of our panelists. I look forward to hearing from all of you. I'm going to begin with Dr. Johnson, who brought some slides to share, and take it away. Dr. J.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Yes, I'm going to kick us off this morning with a conversation related to affordable housing. Talk a little bit about Dallas, but I think what you hear basically applies across the country. So can we go to the first slide? So let's talk a little bit about the trends. It's no secret we're really growing faster than we have since 1950. Our population of color is growing faster than the population as a whole. For a growing number of low-income residents, incomes are not keeping pace with housing costs, and that is a fundamental problem. As we talk more and more about this, this is really an issue tied to income. We are now a majority renter population. The old narrative of home ownership doesn't hold as strong as it did back in our early days. We have less affordable housing than we did 15 years ago, and production is not keeping pace with the loss. Racial disparities persist in all aspects of housing. Geographic patterns of income and racial disparities are influenced by past discriminatory policies. This is sort of the local trend, but any American city you can go to, you're going to probably find something similar. Let's talk a little bit about Dallas a little bit more. So when you start to look at what's taking place in Dallas, the median household income in Dallas really it declined by 16%. We have this sort of up and down sort of roller coaster. Housing is tied heavily to area median incomes. When we start to look at the correlation between jobs and housing, you start to look at over the past decades, 63%. Let me just say it this way. Most of the jobs that are being created are under the $50,000 a year range. And when you start to do a quick analysis on that, you'll quickly see why it doesn't make sense in terms of this sort of issue we're dealing with for affordable housing. When you start to look at the $50,000 a month salary, you're talking about $980 a month. We'll talk a little bit more about that because we know traditional development is about reaching certain financial hurdles, certain thresholds, which oftentimes is in conflict with providing housing at that level. We start to look at the average rent. I would say the numbers you see on the screen are actually rising. According to JLL and other data sources, there's just not enough units out there, and this issue will not subside anytime soon. The latest number out there is about 20,000 units in Dallas, and I would say that number is growing daily. Next slide. So let me just put this on the screen because it's important to really focus in on this. When you hear the concept of affordable housing, what usually happens is this fear factor starts to play in. Oh my goodness, these horrible people are going to be moving to my neighborhoods. This is horrible. When you do a correlation and really look at incomes between 120 to 80%, you really start to see a workforce housing group. 80% of AMI, low income. 50%, very low. 30%, extremely low. And I would argue with anyone to do an analysis based on these numbers and look at your housing costs, you'll get a greater sort of picture of what true affordable housing is. Next slide. So it's really simple. The lack of affordable housing is just not a housing issue. This touches all segments. Someone said to me about a week ago, well, what does housing have to do with economic recovery? It has everything to do with economic recovery. You know, the wage issue, again, is at the center point of the entire issue. Some would say it's funding. I would say it's also related to the lack of income increases. Even with two wage earners, housing is becoming unaffordable for most households. If we use the analogy, you shouldn't spend no more than 30% of your income on housing costs. You start looking at, again, that correlation between housing costs and distress. In terms of housing distress, the numbers are staggering. Without stable, affordable housing, people are hard-pressed to succeed in jobs, education, or raising a family. But this last one, simple economics. To me, it is very simple. If households are paying more for housing costs, then they are actually in a weaker position to support our communities. They will spend less time on items that generate sales taxes and other user fees that basically support our cities. So if the bulk of your money is going towards housing costs, the property owners, okay, they're doing fine, but in general, you don't have much you can contribute to our local economies, in particular in this time of COVID. So let's talk about the challenges. I started talking about reframing this narrative. If you go back and think about affordable housing, the way we talk about this, we tend to make it such that it's a horrific issue that is going to destroy communities, right? And it goes back to the early days of public housing and the perception of, public housing in sort of really harsh-looking elements. And people tend to think that that's coming to my neighborhood, which is really not the case. So we have to figure out a way to talk differently about it. I think the greater conversation lies more around the challenges. The narrative speaks to more of the economic importance of affordable housing. Finding ways to include the greatest need of housing at 30% of AMI. This is just not younger people. This is also older people who are retiring. And I don't know about you guys, I don't know too many seniors that's really retiring with a bunch of money. So the 30% AMI level is going to be tough, which leads to the next bullet that talks about, seniors as part of development projects. I can go on and on about the conversations I've had with senior populations in terms of the need for housing. Here's the big bullet: generating new sources beyond traditional funding. Let me say it this way. On one side of the spectrum, we have the private market, which we try to subsidize to get some affordable housing. Swing back to the other side of the equation. On the other side, we've got low-income housing tax credits. On average, 2.5, 3 years to get one of those done, and then you have public housing. We have to figure out a new way to come up with some different strategies to really deal with this issue. And lastly, expanding capacity to test and deliver new models beyond traditional approaches. If income is the primary issue for developers to reach their financial returns and the two are not aligning, we have to start to think differently. Because on one side of the equation, I mentioned private, let's hope to get some units, tax credits, public housing on the other side. I believe there's tremendous opportunity in the middle to start to test some new ideas and strategies. And I think for Dallas, you saw the number of 20,000 units needed, and you look at the area median income. This is not $150,000 a year area median income. This is hovering around the 50s, which is simply regular people. I'll end with this conversation. Before COVID took place, I was in Starbucks, and this lady asked me, what do I do? I said, I work for the city of Dallas. We're in economic development, affordable housing and everything. She said, oh, wow, those people need housing. I said, so what do you do for a living? She said, I'm a school teacher. I said, do you have one income? She said, yes. I said, well, you're exactly who we're talking about. So how do we change that narrative to start to think differently about affordable housing? So I'll end with that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnson. And next, I will introduce Kourtney Garrett, the President and CEO of Downtown Dallas, Inc.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Dr. Johnson. I think that was a really great entry point to start this conversation about downtown, because here in downtown Dallas, we are sort of this microcosm or a case study of what's happening here in the city. Just to set a little bit of context for those of you from other places, we in downtown Dallas sit at about just under 100 acres. We're a downtown that's bound by a freeway loop, like a lot of American cities. We have about 135,000 people who work in the downtown and 12,000 who live here. I'm going to go into that story in just a minute. If you draw the radius just a little bit broader and start to include some of the neighborhoods that are on the outside of the freeway loop, then we start to jump up to residential numbers more in 70,000, employment's 270,000. So you can kind of look at downtown, or the city center, as we call it in our strategic plan, within the context of those two things. We're also the hub of our regional transportation system. Here in this region, we have the largest public transit system in the nation in terms of number of miles of track. Now, there is some debate about that, and I'll get into it in just a minute, about how much it's really localized and how much it's benefiting us, particularly in the urban core of the city, to help with some of the issues to offset transit costs, as Dr. Johnson started to kind of go down that path. I'm interested in to talk more about that. So our story here is, again, much like many cities across America, much like particularly those in the Sun Belt. We were a booming economy in the 40s and 50s. Downtown was the economic hub. It was the entertainment hub. We had Theater Row. This is where everyone came to shop. And then you fast forward into the 1980s, and again, like many cities, we experienced a significant decline. It was suburban flight trends. It was the savings and loan crisis. It was department store consolidation because we were driven so much by the retail sector here in downtown Dallas. So we spent a good 2 decades within that decline. We were a downtown that truly the sidewalks rolled up at 5 p.m. And there are a lot of jokes about tumbleweeds and firing cannonballs. And it was truly a very, very dark place unless you were employed here and you drove into your office building, parked in the parking garage, worked, and then left. Now, in 1996, to give you some statistics, remember I mentioned we have 12,000 people living in downtown proper today. In 1996, we had 200. So downtown, while it was historically an economic and an entertainment hub, never truly had a significant residential population. So around 1999, there was a lot of conversation here locally, kind of an awakening between the public and the private sectors to say, in order for the city of Dallas to be strong, we need to reinvest in our downtown. So tax increment financing was created. We also saw just nationally the trends of reurbanization. So all of those things came together at the same time with some innovative developers and innovative lenders to start our first adaptive reuse projects. I started in downtown in 2002. We had 40 vacant buildings. Now, all of those buildings, the last one is in redevelopment as we speak. Those have all been turned into primarily residential projects and a few hotels. So that is how we really built the first base of our housing stock here in downtown Dallas. Now, the trend at first was young professionals, young pioneers, people who were willing to not have the grocery store, people who were willing to be, the experimental group. I live downtown. I mean, that was really, I'm kind of thriving in that demographic who first moved down here in around that 2002, 2003 timeframe. Well, now we look at the downtown demographic today, and that's changing. We're maturing or aging, as I like to joke. Our population is getting into those family years, and we don't have the product type to be able to satisfy it. We also have a broader interest. It's no longer that experimental place to live. We've built downtown as a neighborhood. So you do have retirees who want to move downtown. They want the lock and leave. They want the proximity to the arts district. And you also have just a much more broad appeal because of the retail and the services and the parks that have been built up that's drawing a lot more interest in the downtown. Our supply, however, is still very much the 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom if you're lucky. And because of our success over the last 20 years, price points are increasing. I lived for 7 years in one of our very few for sale townhome projects in downtown. And when I sold 7 years after I bought it, good for me, good real estate decision. I doubled what I paid. However, if I was to go back and buy that unit today, it would be a very, very difficult proposition. So we look at where we are in terms of that need to diversify our housing stock and our price point. So for us, a lot of this is currently being looked at through what's called the 360 plan, which is our strategic plan for downtown. We started the comprehensive planning process back in 2011 with the first draft of the plan, and we do it in partnership with the city. So this is a document that a city council adopted, and it is comprehensive in nature. It looks at housing, it looks at transit, it looks at parks and open space and retail development. We updated that plan in 2017 and again adopted unanimously at council. And its priorities are on creating a complete and connected city center. So what that means essentially is we're looking at the downtown as a series of neighborhoods and really stressing the importance of connectivity, multimodal connectivity, mind you, and building not just a number of units. Our goal is not to see how many people we can possibly move into the downtown. It's how are we building neighborhoods and how are we building diversity in our neighborhoods. So I think the other panelists, I think Mahesh and Steffen, you're going to have some great thoughts on the how-tos. Within the 360 plan, some of our priorities are a study to look at the ROI, the economic ROI of affordable and diverse housing product, to really work with the private sector and the public sector on some solutions there. Also advocating with our public policy hats on with the city for some new policy to come forward to create this. And really, I think that the last and really our sweet spot is looking at how we're building quality of life, how we're enhancing that multimodal transit, how we are creating proximity and access so that we can offset some of those transit costs, for example, by having jobs close to housing, close to schools, close to retail, and close to services. Because overall, our organization's goals truly are to build a downtown that is the place where everyone in the city has access to jobs, housing, and a great quality of life.
Thank you, Kourtney. And I want to thank you personally because I started working in downtown Dallas in 1996, which was the year that the light rail system, which has since grown to have the most miles of track anywhere in the world, first started its red and blue lines. And I also want to thank the global audience for joining us today. I know that we have people who've said hello in the chat room from all over the world. Please continue to post your questions for our panelists there. And obviously, through the lens of Texas, we are able to see a lot of common concerns and hopefully a lot of common solutions. And for that, I would like to introduce Steffen from McKinsey.
Well, thank you for setting the bar high to suggest that we would have the solution. I appreciate that challenge. I hope we can offer some thoughts for inspiration, not necessarily for solution. And I do have to say that Kourtney's virtual background of the downtown is really, really awesome. And I would love to have a copy of that because I think that represents our city incredibly well. Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you, Kourtney, for, I think, shining a light on the reality. At McKinsey, we obviously come at this much more from a lens of how can we actually help to have impact. And I think, Catherine, that goes a little bit to your question. Before I go there, let me just put out 2 or 3 stats that I thought, as I was preparing for this panel, were very, on the one hand, shocking and depressing. On the other hand, I think also hopefully a path towards the solution. If we think about Dallas as a city and we think about affordability of our city across the nation, the latest numbers I had seen, we ranked 177th in that list, which means we are certainly not one of the cities that are destined to have great affordability. And it's in particular, I think, interesting, and it ties a little bit, Kourtney, to your personal experience, that a lot of our affordability issue actually is in the starting housing market. Our developers in the city have very much focused on redeveloping the downtown core. And I remember I've been coming to Dallas since 2006, before I moved here in 2016. And I remember the downtown core rather being vacant. But now you actually look downtown core and we have a lot of high-end real estate, which certainly was helped. But at the same time, I think it has made affordability so much harder. And so I think this notion of we are not a very affordable city and we have a particular challenge in the starting housing market, I think those are facts to keep in mind. And I think the second number that I thought was very interesting is about 60% of the county as well as the city residents are actually renters and not owners. And as you think about our nation as a whole in markets where home ownership truly matters, and I think Dr. Johnson goes a little bit to your comment as well around retirement planning. I think a lot of people think about a home as an asset that they can leverage in order to have affordability over the long run and into retirement. I think those 2 stats to me were 2 stats that really stood out as factors that we need to think about in addressing. And I think the third point that was made that I think cannot be underestimated, and really for us at least is one of the components that we focus on, is this notion of inclusive growth. The highway loop in our city clearly presents its challenges. It is in a way a divider for our city. But at the same time, we need to think about inclusive growth also in the sense of opportunities where the jobs are. The jobs are in the city of Dallas, north of the downtown core, possibly even branching into Frisco and into Plano. And the tracks that you talked about, unfortunately, don't reach that. And so how do we make it inclusive growth, both in the sense of bringing jobs as well as offering transportation solutions? I think, Kourtney, you made the point about multimodal transportation solutions. I think all those pieces need to be addressed. And when you then really pull up and you look at it in the big picture, you realize that this is not just a silver bullet type solution. Affordable housing in itself is a part, I think, or a step into the right direction, but by itself may actually fall short of the challenge that we're trying to address, which is how do we actually create a vital downtown core that is vibrant, where people want to live, where people can go to work, and where people have affordability defined at large in the sense of they can actually choose to spend their time in both their working hours as well as their leisure time in the same place without having to commute long distances. So with that kind of framing and looking at it from our perspective across the nation, but also frankly across the globe, I would just offer 5 thoughts and happy to pick those up as we go through the panel discussion. I think the first one is a real push towards unlocking the land. Kourtney, you talked about how much land there is available, but when every single time I go downtown and I think about the downtown core and how spread out our city is, I think thinking about how do we unlock more land in order to make more land available to develop it, and this is both public land, I think this is transit adjacent land, think about single family zone land, we even talked about religious organizations, literally everything. What are the levers we can pull in order to increase the pool of available land? I think that to us is one of the key drivers and strategies. And by the way, we've seen this in LA and in Seattle and other places where that has helped to improve the situation. I think the second piece is how do we get to lower cost? As you think about technologies in constructions have evolved, I mentioned in the introduction I have the pleasure of convening our global construction practice, and as I think about advancements in construction, we think about modular construction, we think about micro units, we think about ways to reduce the cost of home ownership. And modular construction in particular to us is a very interesting technology that has, interestingly enough, not taken hold in the US as much as it has in other parts of the world. You think about Europe, you think about Scandinavia in particular, you think about Asia, modular construction is a technology that is quite available, readily accepted in the market. And I do think reducing the overall cost in order to reduce the affordability burden is a big opportunity. And so we would offer that as a second thought. I think the third point is reducing the time. And I think reducing the time, uncertainty, and complexity of approval processes. I think this is not necessarily just a Dallas challenge. I think this is a challenge across the globe, wherever we're engaging. We very often see approval processes being one of the biggest inhibitors to successfully addressing some of these challenges and bring innovation into the conversation. It often stops already there and it doesn't even go to step 2. And so how do we collectively work together in order to simplify approval processes, and how do we work collectively together in order to reduce the time? The third, I would say, and this hopefully is an area where Mahesh can help us and shed some light on, is let's go and find the money. I think at the end of the day, if we only look at the city and we only look at city budgets, I think we will always be somewhat constrained in what the abilities are that we can do. But what are the innovative ways for us to think about this beyond the housing? We talked about inclusive growth, and so therefore, what are opportunity zones can do for us? How can we think about tax credits? What are the different ways we can be truly creative in creating an opportunity to increase the pool of money? And where do public-private partnerships come into play? We strongly believe they have a role to play in the right context with the right guardrails. And again, I won't speak out of school because that clearly is Mahesh's expertise, but I do think finding the money is the fourth and a very important lever. And then last but not least, I would say truly turbocharging the process of creating a fully integrated plan. I think, Kourtney, the plan that you have developed with your team around what's the vision for the downtown core is fantastic. We need to think about how do other stakeholders in our city tie into this. As we talk about the highways, obviously our transportation agency has a role to play. We think about the city of Dallas and DARTs and what's their role. And so how do we truly create a transit-oriented development plan that actually allows us to have the enablers in place so that we have inclusive growth? and then how do we bring these different pieces together? And so when you really, really, I think, pull up to a 10,000 foot level, you realize this is both a challenge in the sense of what does the private sector need to do, what's the public sector need to do, but I think most importantly, it's a change management challenge, and how do we bring all these different people together at the same table, working off the same blueprint? Because if there's one thing I've learned in 20 plus years of working in this business, everybody always has a great plan. The question is, do we have one plan, and how do we execute collectively against that one plan? And I think that can be a big unlock for our city. So happy to explore any of those as we go through the panel discussion, but hopefully those are some ideas and food for thought.
Thank you so much, Steffen. There were definitely a lot of heads nodding in agreement with what you were sharing. And for our non-Texas audiences who may not have recognized the suburbs of Plano and Frisco, which were mentioned, those are in a different county from Texas, but like so many cities around the world, our transportation exported a lot of the value of the urban core to suburbs and exurbs. And through the good work of our panelists today, we are diversifying and invigorating our urban core, which was built around state-of-the-art mass transit a century ago. So one of the reasons that our urban core has the density and the walkability and the appeal for development of workforce housing is because it was built around a streetcar, and now we're paying dearly to recreate that system. And I will now introduce our final panelist for introductory remarks. No pressure, Mahesh, that we've put on you talking about putting the affordability in affordable housing. Aiyer from Citi, please.
Thanks, Catherine. And as Steffen said, the bar is set high. You know, Texas, I think, as a whole, is reflective of a lot of other communities, states, and countries, right? Over last 3 decades, we've had 60%, give or take, population growth. So if you think about it, over 60% of the people that are here today in the great state of Texas were not in Texas back in 1990. That's quite remarkable, right? So even as we've gone through major economic cycles over 3 decades, the population has still grown and grown and grown. So let me give everyone maybe a little bit of a backdrop to Texas affordable housing over the last 3 decades and kind of where we are today and maybe what we can do going forward. So as we got into the 90s and got through the early 90s recession, growth was on a heavy trajectory throughout Texas. You had a lot of people first moving here to major metropolitan areas throughout Texas, and initially affordable housing going to something that Kourtney had indicated earlier, where you could buy, for example, a townhome, a condominium, some type of business district or adjacent to closer into downtown type housing at more reasonable prices. The access points to affordable housing were in fact a bit easier because you had a lot of what I call Class C and Class D product on the multifamily side that had been built in prior economic cycles in the 60s and 70s. And while they weren't terrifically built housing from decades ago, they were still functional units that could provide affordable housing and entry points to a number of families and seniors, and same thing in the single family side. As you got through kind of the technology recession in the early 2000s, Texas was no different, right? The price of oil subsided for a bit of time in its own ups and downs. And one thing that was interesting, for a long time, you did not have, as Dr. Johnson noted, AMI growth substantially. So when you measured household income, that tended to be flat or not much of a growth. I remember very distinctly, I've been doing affordable housing in Texas since the late 90s. At a period of time between 2002 and 2006, where rents didn't go up virtually at all, but operating expenses were rock solid and kept increasing. So the burden on both households were significant, with with a lot more operating expenses, and landlords, right? Because they have to develop the affordable housing. And fortunately for renters, at least, the rents were tended to be flat, so they can make their way through even as operating expenses would increase. But at that point, we still had a huge amount of affordable housing on the drawing board coming through. I think, at least in Texas, there was a major secular shift around 2008. And I know in the Houston area where I live, Hurricane Katrina to our east in New Orleans and the surrounding areas was a major event. Overnight, I think from 2008, in that time frame, if you call it from 2007 to 2010, what you began to see was a significant decline in home ownership, right? Because there were a lot of issues with single family mortgages going on. At the same time, people needed a place to live. And I remember distinctly financing a development in the Fort Worth side of the Dallas-Fort Worth metro. And it was in a community, and it was targeted to 50% of area median income in a suburban landscape. And there were so many more houses up for sale in that community that those families moved to this development, and it was literally 100% leased as it got to completion so that families could keep their kids in the same schools. So along with a shift to a greater renter population, as Dr. Johnson noted, the other aspect is that the Class C and D properties from the earlier decades were now considered really obsolete, right? Totally different building codes in today's world, and they just simply were not functional. A lot of the properties didn't have what you call good bones for the current modern era, for whether to meet code standards. So they were taken offline. Same thing with single family development. Part of that was redevelopment in those areas, and part of that was they're just simply not functional. So all of a sudden in the supply demand equation, you had a significant increase in demand at the absolute wrong moment when a significant portion of supply was going offline. And if you look at trends, and I would imagine it's very consistent across the United States and probably all across the globe in a variety of areas. For most of this last decade, from 2008, 2009, at least until you got to the latter part of last decade, what you saw here in Texas and all the major cities was roughly, on the multifamily side, less than 1,000 units of affordable housing per year online, right? Because the tools we had, the housing tax credit program, other types of development tools, could further maybe 1,000 units where per year, where the prior decade, where we had more substantive growth in affordable housing, we had we had a lot of capital market financing tools that down south in the southern United States were not as available or practical post-Great Recession. And what that meant was, in many communities like Dallas, for example, where you might have been seeing 5,000 units per year, you're down to less than 1,000. Pretty constricted. Now, at the same time, going back to my original comment of population growth, take Dallas Metro as an example. 20+% population growth per decade for the last 3 decades. Population growth is unabated. At the same time, you're restricting the supply. Same thing in Houston, 20% population growth. The Austin Metro, 35 to 40% population growth per decade. And San Antonio, which has some of the best food in the state, that's why I tend to travel there and want to do developments too, had 20% per decade of population growth. And that doesn't even account the other 26, 27 MSAs in the great state of Texas, right? So as we get to the latter part of last decade, some things started adjusting, I think, in a very favorable way. Tax-exempt bond financing, private activity bonds, which had been a fabulous tool in the prior decade, in the first decade of the 2000s, began to come back on the drawing board with more developments. And you can see on the multifamily side, product increasing at a pretty healthy rate. Not enough in any way, shape, or form to keep up with the demand growth, but at least getting supply somewhat headed in the right direction toward where it was in the 2000s, but understanding we have a vastly higher population than we did a decade ago, 15 years ago, right? So from that standpoint, what are some of the tools that have enabled this to occur, right? Going to Steffen's point on the financing side. Low interest rates obviously have been extraordinarily helpful in getting housing financing done, because at the end of the day, when you're talking about lower income housing to moderate income housing, you're talking about debt financing a large part, along with some equity subsidies, but the debt has to get repaid, right? It's not typically forgiven debt from private institutions. So from that standpoint, low interest debt has been a huge benefit and has caused a lot of growth there. But also, I think, a deep engagement in public-private partnerships, right? Because what we saw after the Great Recession all across the country, and again, I'm assuming this is a global issue, developers of housing who want to put their best foot forward are realizing, so are municipalities, that municipalities are important stakeholders. And the kind of conversations that the private sector in development has had with the public entities over the last decade has improved tremendously. And that has allowed for things like tax abatements, which here in Texas, given no state income tax and a harder, at times a much harder environment to get subordinate debt financing, other types of direct funding from municipalities who are more resource constrained, right? A lot of money is going into schools and roads and other things. It's hard for housing. Tax abatements have been a great tool. In the last couple of years, what we have seen in Texas and a number of states is what we call income averaging, which has been a huge tool. So going to Dr. Johnson's point of what we consider affordable, traditionally affordable housing has been 60% of area median income or less, right? Which is still a hard target population that you want to reach for affordable housing, because there's a lot of demand in that spectrum, unfortunately, from 0 to 60%. But the 80% AMI has been acutely sensitive too, right? If you go back to my earlier comment of Class C and D properties not being as readily available due to age and obsolescence, there's not much in the way of Class B properties either these days. So everyone is building to high standards, which is great for communities, right? Today, we're pretty close to LEED standard on building development. So a lot of communities aren't quite Silver LEED, but the cost of construction is getting pretty close to Silver LEED. They have like maybe 70 to 80% of the components. So it's a high threshold. So you can't just build something brand new and have it be something that's more moderate in nature. So as a result, income averaging has been a good tool as well, increasing the spectrum of the 80% AMI units and then targeting maybe 40% and averaging out to 60, which a lot of the housing programs here have targeted. But again, I think going forward, what we're seeing is a lot more in the way of mixed income housing, where you're blending in, depending on the neighborhoods and the communities, going to what everyone has been talking about, a mix of some market rate, 80% AMI units, and deeper affordability skew. And I'll leave you with this note in my home community of Houston. We've been deeply engaged with Hurricane Harvey redevelopment, which has impacted us tremendously. And all the new housing is trying to benefit across the spectrum of 40% AMI up to 80% AMI with some market rate units. And our market is not really the luxury market. It's really targeting 100% AMI, for which there's substantial need. So I am an optimist, and I think there are some good financing tools available. Certainly not yet as well developed to meet the housing need, but I think we're also headed in the right direction in many respects. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Mahesh. And your solutions-oriented comments are a great transition to our first question in the chat room, and you can leave more questions, but we'll start with one from our MC, Greg Lindsay, who asks Kourtney, although I would open it up to Dr. Johnson and others as well, what are the tools at your disposal to diversify the housing stock in our urban core and make cities more resilient in the event of climate events like those Mahesh mentioned, as well as just economic events like the one we're in the middle of right now?
Sure. Well, first, hi, Greg. Great to see your name over there. Greg did a phenomenal presentation here just a few years ago at one of our annual luncheons and is a big hit. So he knows this market well. So it may be a little bit of a softball question. It's an interesting time. And, honestly, it's so great to be sharing the screen with Dr. Johnson right now, because our tools traditionally have really revolved around tax increment financing. I mentioned in my opening comments that we created the first TIF downtown in 1996. The second was created in about 2003. And really those two mechanisms, along with historic preservation tax credits, were responsible for the first wave of residential. That was the first 40 of our vacant buildings being transformed. Now we have, and Mahesh, with the Galbraith 2400 Bryan, have started to utilize, whether it's state credits, whether it's other local credits that are offered by the city. It's kind of a mixed bag. And for about the last 3 years, I would say, really, well, yes, since 2017, the adoption of the updated the 360 plan, we've really been looking forward to updated city policy and looking at how we now both of our TIFs are basically exhausted. So we have to start to find some new tools. And at the same time, we need to balance the reinvestment in the downtown with other areas of the city where there's tremendous need and tremendous opportunity. So there are a couple of phenomenon that are at play. So the study that Greg knows well, because we've talked about it quite a bit, that we've finished the RFP. We'll probably let it within the next few months here. We hit this little hiccup called a pandemic. But the study is to look at, again, the return on investment. We really want to look at this issue for the downtown at a micro scale. We want to look at the economics of just the downtown area and show from a third-party analysis perspective, and Steffen, maybe you guys can help us with this, where are those gaps? And how can we leverage both the lending community from the private sector side, as well as the private development community, with our partnerships in the public sector to make up for the gaps, to look at the deltas, because we're seeing this success in other cities. It's now, we have to double down on it, and we have to do it here. And we've been so successful in the downtown in such a short amount of time, we're really challenged by the economics.
Dr. Johnson, do you want to add to the quiver of arrows that we are using to hit this target?
Yeah, let me just say this. I think we need a different class of developer operating in our communities. And I think that different class is, we all know that hitting certain financial returns aligned with certain types of financing drives a lot of this. But I believe there is a way we can start to think somewhat differently about the type of developers, because not all developers are the same. Not all developer financial models are the same. So when we use the word developer, it assumes that they all are the same. I think we need a different class that is focusing somewhat more on this shared value perspective, right? That is really starting to align the production of housing where it's not mutually exclusive. Great projects that are great business models, but they also serve to address growing social and economic challenges. So I know we're going to be looking at those types of models coming out of the city. We're launching a housing nexus study, and Kourtney, I have to talk to you some more about this, but we're going to really drill down into this and start to look at some creative ideas. We recently approved the Public Finance Corporation model in Dallas, which has not been done before, and we're going to test some of these ideas. And we have the ability to do two sort of creative projects. So I'm going to put the development community to a test around the country, around the world. I don't care where they are. We're going to sort of set sort of a different type of piece. So the city of Dallas owns land. The city of Dallas has trust fund dollars. The city of Dallas has all of these tools. How can we start to use them somewhat differently to try and get at that mix of housing that we really need to try and get, that's not so heavily driven by 12% returns or whatever the numbers are. I think that's what it's going to really start to take to do some things somewhat differently. So that's what I have to say.
And Catherine, if I could, I want to play off of what Dr. Johnson said about the development, kind of the models, what we're used to. I mean, Dallas is a very development-driven city, so I agree wholeheartedly that we have to look at things through a new lens. So, Mahesh, I know your experience at 2400 Bryan with Southwest. I mean, we have a handful of developers who are working toward these projects. And when I say handful, I do mean handful right now. But I also know from working with Jack and working with Christian at Matthews quite a bit on this project that took creativity beyond what we've seen before in a project downtown. So I'd actually love to hear your synopsis of how you guys got that one done.
That was a heavy labor of love. And I think going to something that Steffen alluded to, one thing with creativity, it takes time, right? It takes time. And it's a large development relative to affordable size standards at 216 units in downtown Dallas with a mix of incomes. So there's something for everyone. And a huge participation and involvement, both financially and support-wise, from the city of Dallas, right? Along with the Matthews team that has done a lot of creative development within the city of Dallas in that framework. It takes time. That development had been on the drawing board for a number of years. Right? And what you really need to do is have, I think, a lot of stability in the process, so that when someone undertakes and goes down an avenue, they can sense that there's an end to it, right? That so part of it is trying to see how you can reduce the time for creativity, so you can get it within 2 to 3 years rather than 3 to 5 on contemplation. And how do you have more of those developments going on at the same time? And so I think there's a fair amount of logistics to balance that. But at the same time, going through that process, I will tell you there's a lot of thoughtfulness that has to go in there, because you are balancing a lot of various stakeholder interests in managing what those outcomes are going to be. So oftentimes it's easy, and nothing's easy anymore, but it's easy to get into something. And it's a lot harder to ultimately get the outcome that you're happy with, so that it's sustainable and, frankly, gets everyone happy about doing the next development. Because one of the challenges with when you hit the ground running on something, if it doesn't go so well, is it makes it just that much harder for the next development and the next opportunity to be creative, because everyone loves creativity until the impact is not what it was hoped for. And there's got to be a fair amount of patience along with cutting down the timeline, because I agree, there's a lot of creativity here, there's a lot of thoughtfulness, and frankly, we're developing housing right where it's needed in an optimal spot that I think is a win-win for everyone.
Let me just add to this, because and it addresses, I think, Catherine, one of the questions that is coming in around what are innovations. I actually think Dr. Johnson used a very important word, and I assert for a second that you were intentional about using the word production rather than construction. Because I do think, as we think about mixed-use developments and what are these opportunities in order to reduce schedule and at the same time reduce cost, we need to take much more of a production mindset than a construction mindset. Let me explain for a second what we think the difference there is. And it addresses the question on what are the innovative ideas on how to deliver these projects. I think as we move from one-off type of projects to repeatable units that are being able to be utilized differently, Mahesh, to your point around mixed-use development, and how do we not just offer housing solution, but how do we offer housing solutions that also have retail space or other job employment opportunities at the same time, in the same development at the same time. So we move from I'm building a unit to I'm actually building a development, and that development serves multiple purposes, addresses the needs, and I can do it at a lower cost way. I think that's the way where I think there's some real innovation coming to the forefront. And right now, I think, Kourtney, this comes to your comment about there's a handful of developers that have that kind of mindset, but I also think that capability. And we shouldn't underestimate that requires a slightly different operating model. Dr. Johnson talked about a different business model. I think this ultimately always comes down to people that actually have the ability to think along those different lines and have that playbook in order to be able to execute against this. I really do think, and this is why I like your word, Dr. Johnson, around production so much, it is not that we have to innovate what we do. I actually think that already exists. The modular construction, the prefabrication, all that kind of stuff is actually the easy part of the question. It's the how do we put it together? How do we package it in a way that is an integrated solution that addresses all those needs versus an individual need, be it a profit orientation or be it a development or being affordable housing. This integrated package, I think, this is the key part. And if you ask me, I think this is where the city can play a big role, because I think if the city were to set that expectation that a development is going to have to address all those different needs, oh, and by the way, has to utilize different production technologies like modular or prefabricated or other things, I think you actually can be in a way an accelerator, an enabler for us in order to see some of these innovative ideas come to fruition.
Well, I know that our panelist, Kourtney, has to drop off. We are at our time, but Kourtney, if you have a last word, we can start with you and each of our panelists can sign off. And for those who are able to stay for lunch to chat with our panelists, there were many good questions in the chat. We didn't have time to, but hopefully some of our panelists can stay after this session adjourns. Kourtney.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Yes, I'm jumping into a board meeting, actually, which our board is a very large cross-section of our downtown development and investment community. So I have a lot of takeaways to share. Thank you. I'm going to look incredibly impressive at my meeting here in just a minute. But I will tell you, we as an organization are committed to this issue, very much so. And if nothing has shown us the importance of attention to it, it has been the last 120 days. Whether you're talking about social equity or you're talking about the need for healthy communities with the pandemic crisis. So we are committed. We actually have just on our website and on all of our social media channels posted a new plan for both recovery and inclusion. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that. And it's really our recommitment to diversified housing, as well as building the neighborhoods and the services that are attractive and give access and opportunity for all in our city. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to tapping back into this and more NewCities programming. And hopefully we'll all be here in Dallas sometime very soon. We were definitely looking forward to hosting the conference. So we'll see you all again soon. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Kourtney. Steffen, I'll reverse the order a little since you've had to follow others. Any parting thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for organizing this. And again, thank you for giving us an opportunity to contribute. I think there is no shortage of ideas. That's what I take away from this conversation. I think we all collectively have a particular lens at the problem. I think the solutions are out there, and many of those have been tested in other markets. I think the question really is, how do we bring it to our city, and how do we bring it together in a way that allows us to collectively address the challenges? I think that to me is the biggest takeaway from this conversation. And I thank all of you for the contributions, and Dr. Johnson for your leadership in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahesh. Do you want to give us the last word on the whole state of Texas?
I would agree with a lot of the comments that were made. There are, I think, opportunities for innovative solutions, and at times it may not seem that way, but we have a lot of bright people, I think, trying to work through different avenues to get things done. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic that we're going to be headed in the right path for that. And there's some things that will take longer, but ultimately, I think a number of the tools that I'm seeing being used are headed in the right direction. And we can always do more and do better. But I think we've got a lot of really good people and a lot of really good ideas working at in the right direction these days. Thank you again for having me as well.
Thank you. And last word to you, Dr. Johnson.
Yes, I would just conclude with saying that we may be in challenging times right now, but I also think it's an opportunity to really test and come up with some creative solutions. I think if there's any moment in time where we can do it. I think it's now, and I also think it's about creating a new roadmap. I'm going to use the word, it's like we're going to war. We need a battle plan. We need a plan that will connect the dots across every sort of element that we have, whether it's transportation, housing, economic development, underserved communities. I believe this is the time to really do it. So I think, you're going to hear some innovative approaches coming out of the city. We're going to try and put everybody to the test to step up. So that is what I really have to say. And that I will conclude that it's a great opportunity now, and let's take advantage of it.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to all the participants whose great questions we didn't have time for. And we hope to continue the conversation at lunch. Have a good day and a good conference.